What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to another episode of the vlog. So, every one of these episodes this year, I think 5 of them now so far, have started out with me saying it's been a long time since I've done one of these, and saying that I need to do more of them, and really, it is the truth. I really should be doing these on a more regular basis, just talking about photography stuff, interesting things going on in the realm of photography. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Or rather, today I'm going to be talking about a thought that I have had that has been running through my mind for a while, and I haven't been able to decide whether it's the right direction or the wrong direction, or rather it's the right analysis of the sort of situation or the wrong analysis of the situation. So what I'm talking about is here this time around is this thought that I've been having: is raw photography, or raw as a still image format, dying? Okay, maybe that's a little over-exaggerated or a little, hyperbolic, but it seems to me, and of course this is definitely biased by my perspective as a Canon photographer, Canon user, that raw across the board is kind of getting beaten up by sort of a death of 1,000 cuts. And some of this is due to engineering decisions, I think, that are being made in the specifically lens design. And some of this, I think, is just maybe I don't really know, or maybe I'm not, seeing the whole picture here. So the big function of what's going on, at least in my opinion, is the design decision that's being made by the optical engineers at all of the companies. So nobody gets off on this one scot-free, at least not in the small format space, at least not between Canon, Nikon, Sony, Panasonic, Olympus at all. Now that we are using mirrorless cameras, and now that they no longer have to rely on the people being able to see things through the viewfinder. So once you no longer have that truth of you actually are seeing what the lens is seeing through a viewfinder, the camera can do whatever processing it wants to the image in a mirrorless. You no longer have to really constrain yourself to not having optical or software corrections to optical lenses. And so we are now seeing mandatory lens corrections happening. And this, like I said, is not just a Canon thing. Nikon is doing it as well. On top of that, and maybe this is more from my perspective as a Canon user, but we have seen sort of this deviation or departure of features that aren't supporting RAW anymore. And I think a lot of this comes back to those lens corrections. So multiple exposure mode, multi-shot super resolution that Canon just introduced in the latest firmware, the EOS R5. Both of these cases are places where Canon, at least, has started to depart from making an implementation that's either works with every image format that you shoot in or works in RAW specifically. So I wanted to kind of talk about this and sort of explore the thought process on all of this. And like I said, I think the big factor here is really lens corrections, or the move towards requiring digital lens corrections to be done on lenses, or done in camera, or done to images, so that lenses can have higher levels of correctable artifacts. So we see more and more distortion is not something that camera manufacturers are trying to correct out entirely optically. They're relying on distortion correction. Chromatic aberrations are, again, something that's relying more and more on lens corrections. And like I said, everybody's doing this. I think Canon is probably the most egregious in this process so far. So we have lenses like the RF 24 to 105 f4 to 7.1, so the entry-level consumer 24 to 105 zoom, that don't even cover the whole full frame sensor area at 24 millimeters. There's a handful of lenses like this in Canon's lineup, and you have mechanical vignetting from the lens, the lens mount, or not the mount, but the actual, like, the back mechanism of the lens in these situations. And the solution, as far as Canon's concerned, is we will just distortion correct it into correctness and it'll be fine. And maybe on an entry-level lens, that's not a horrible way to do it. Certainly, my perspective on this from, say, a professional photography situation, even a serious hobbyist photography situation, is I don't particularly like that thought process. I would like to have the lens. I don't mind distortion correction, but I don't think we should be stretching out a 80% smaller area in the image to the full frame area just because we wanted to have a, say, 24 to 105, because that lens doesn't have the mechanical vignetting at 28 or something like that. It's only like at the widest focal length. So, I mean, I can kind of understand it on the entry-level lens, kind of doing something that egregious, but then the same kind of situation even plays out far less egregiously at the high end. So Canon's RF 14 to 35 f4L IS-USM has enough distortion in the image that Canon requires lens corrections to be made to that lens. And as a consequence of that, it gets excluded from, for example, multiple exposure mode on the EOS R5, where the camera it won't let you shoot multiple exposures with that lens attached, or the 24 to 105 f4 to 7.1 either. Any of these lenses that need such egregious or so much distortion correction that they, it's mandatorily enforced one way or another, kind of all fall into this category of certain features are locked out. And like I said, it's not like Canon's the only company doing this. Nikon in the Z-mount mirrorless cameras with the Z-mount lenses has a number of lenses that have mandatory lens corrections applied to them, including some of the S-series lenses, so they're high-end or flagship, whatever you want to call it, in that scope. You could see this if you're a Lightroom user, if you look at the lens, the details, I think it is, or lens correction, one of those panels. I don't have a computer in front of me right now, and I don't pay enough attention to it because I have defaults set up, but whatever. If you look at that, it will say lens profile correction applied, and you will not have the ability to turn it off or do anything like that. Now, as I said, Nikon is not nearly as egregious as this about this as Canon is. Certainly not as egregious as Canon's low-end lenses are, but they're still doing it. And again, I'm not saying that this is wrong or a bad thought, design process. The reality, at least on the lens situation, is that lenses are getting more expensive. People want more for less, which just doesn't happen. You ask photographers, what they want, what kind of lens, what they want in a lens, and they want it to be fast. They want it to have a huge zoom range. They want it to have impeccable optical quality. They want it to have no distortion, no chromatic aberration, no vignetting, none of these things, and no breathing, parafocal design, smooth focusing for video, fast focusing for stills. I mean, it's a no-win situation from an optical engineering standpoint. The old saying, good, fast, cheap, pick two. Well, now we're talking about, a dozen things, optimize for something and still try to deliver a product that people are willing to pay for. And like I said, I have sympathy with the optical engineers on, all of the lens manufacturers, because engineering is always about trade-offs, and it's always a challenge, and there's always, give and take. And when you've got a market that's pushing for, I want 10x zoom, I want no vignetting, I want fast aperture, I want, the autofocus stuff is not as big of a thing, but that actually plays into it, what your focusing elements are doing. Fast autofocus, smooth autofocus. Oh, and I don't want to pay more than $100 for this. I've seen so many people scoff at $2,000 or $1,000 and $2,000 lenses, and even when they're good lenses, and they're still like, I wouldn't pay that much money. That's ridiculous. This lens shouldn't be that expensive. Well, that's what happens when you start putting all of these cross-place demands or demands on a lens design, plus inflation, the cost of materials and stuff goes up, all of that kind of thing. You're just they have to compromise somewhere. And like I said, I can understand the lens corrections being they're a great compromise. You take a lens that's got a little distortion but a lot of resolution, and you get rid of the distortion with some lens corrections, and the images look great. You don't have as big of an issue with, well, now I've got to try and make it both corrected for distortion and high resolution and not have chromatic aberrations. You can focus on the things that the engineers, at least, can focus on the things that are much harder to really correct out. So you could trade a little bit of distortion for more resolution or better resolution. You could trade a little bit of distortion or a little bit of chromatic aberration for some higher resolution or a simpler design that's less expensive. And so you have to correct it out in software, but it's not that big of consideration in that respect. But that brings us to the sort of problem with this, which is none of this works with RAW. RAW images are really just the raw, like as the name implies, sensor information being pulled out of the sensor and put in a file for the user, or that you can then process later. And we get huge benefits with RAW, which is why I shoot RAW when I'm doing still photography. At least it's a little too space intensive on the video side of things for me, but you have the full maximum dynamic range of the sensor. There is nothing cutting that down. So if you're shooting JPEG, even though it's an 8-bit format, you have, because of the quote gamma curve, although I think the more appropriate term there would be the optoelectric transfer function, or but you get more like 10 or 11 stops instead of the 8 stops that it would be if it was a linear file. But on RAW, you can get more than that. You can get pushing 14 stops on most of the modern high-end cameras of actual, usable data. Not quite as much photographically because of, how much detail you have in the shadows. But there is, from at least engineering sense, almost 14 stops worth of information there. But you can't manipulate it. That's the problem. It can't be manipulated in camera. You can't twist it and distort it with all of these lens corrections, which ultimately cascades into the limitations that are imposed on RAW users from these cameras. So there are certain things like, for example, at least on Canon's side, multiple exposure mode and pixel shift high res or super resolution, at least the way Canon implemented it, that you just can't do with RAW. Well, the pixel shift I'll come back to, because that's a weird, I don't quite understand what's going on there, but I can certainly understand the case with multiple exposure. So on the EOS R5 and R6 multiple exposure mode, you can shoot in RAW, or I think JPEG. If you want the output in JPEGs, you can do that in the camera, but I've only ever used it in RAW. And these are the last two Canon cameras that have supported multiple exposure using RAW images. Everything now is JPEG. And JPEG, in some cases, makes sense. Because distortion correction can be applied to the image before the image is, processed. It's added, subtracted, averaged, whatever. the camera doesn't have to worry about what your lens is doing, how distorted your lens is. So there are no limits to what lenses you can use. You can use any lens with the JPEG-based multiple exposure mode. With the RAW-based multiple exposure mode, like on the R5, well, if you choose the wrong lens to put on your camera to do your multiple exposure, it won't work. You can't use it. So for example, that RF14 to 35 f4L, there is enough required distortion correction in that lens that the camera will not let you use the lens in multiple exposure mode, which can be frustrating or not, depending on what you're doing. Again, the engineering behind this, the decision tree behind this gets complicated. I use multiple exposure mode for basically synthesizing neutral density. It's a much better method, in my opinion, than actual neutral density. Typically, I'll end up using a combination of the two, but whenever you stack and average images, you get a lower noise output. So you get essentially more dynamic range out of your images. So if you ever play with multiple exposure, like on the R5 or R6 or any of the multiple exposure cameras with the multiple exposure mode, throw your camera in like ISO 102,000 and shoot an 8-shot average and look at how clean that image will be. It's like 3200 or 1600 or even potentially better. So if you're shooting long neutral density situations, in a lot of cases, you're way better off, if you can shoot 8 images and stack them to get the time and the blur and motion that you want, than if you just put an ND filter on the lens and shoot with a 3-stop ND or something to that effect. So I can understand, especially given Canon's history with how they implement features or how they allow features to go. So Canon has always been more or less conservative on at least I would call it conservative, on ensuring that whatever they are providing as a feature actually works all the time. So a perfect example of this is the autofocus systems on Canon DSLRs. And, I'm sure there's niche points where people make an argument against this as being the general rule, or a specific instance where Canon has violated this general rule. But by and large, this seems to be Canon's thing. So if you look at like the autofocus systems on DSLRs, yeah, I know it's ancient history, but if the sensor was spec'd for f5.6 and faster lenses, if you put an f8 lens and teleconverter on it, it didn't work at all. It just shut off the autofocus system. And I've been burned by this, specifically on Canon or on Nikon cameras where they don't shut off the autofocus system. So if you go outside of the actual capabilities of or at least they didn't in the past. Now, certainly Nikon's mirrorless cameras now have much more capable autofocus systems than their DSLRs did in 2008, 9, and 10. But back in 2008, 9, and 10, when I was playing with Nikon stuff regularly, the autofocus systems, they wouldn't shut off. So if you put an f8 lens and teleconverter combination in, and you didn't know, because at the time that I did this, I was borrowing a camera. I wasn't 100% familiar with the capabilities because I was a Canon shooter and didn't, any way you cut it, it was my fault sort of for not knowing what the limitations were. But if you put that combination on the Nikon camera, it would just try to focus, which ultimately resulted in pictures where things were out of focus, but I thought they were in focus because the camera was indicating that it had focused, but it didn't focus properly because the situation was outside of what the sensor could do. And I think Canon, even when they sort of break that thought process of if we can't deliver it properly, we're not going to deliver it at all, are still trying to hold to that thought process. So like I could see the shift for multiple exposure mode going away from RAW into JPEG with, we'll look at on the R5 and R6 with RAW multiple exposure. It's confusing and some lenses don't work and people are angry because, you know, I use this lens, but it doesn't work and this other lens does. And how am I supposed to know what's what? And this is all kind of crap. And quite honestly, it kind of is. How do we fix that? Well, we just get rid of the RAW and we do it in JPEG where we can make sure that every lens works. The problem for me at least is we aren't really, at least as a RAW shooter, I'm not seeing a return. So they take a function away. Multiple exposure is no longer a RAW function, it's a JPEG function. They don't replace it with something that helps us as a RAW user. So for example, you could have just synthetic neutral density, basically the stack and average mode of multiple exposure implemented that worked in RAW as well as JPEG. You don't have to worry so much about the lens distortion problems or the lens correction problems, because if you're shooting essentially synthetic neutral density, you're not going to be changing the lens's focus or zoom. You know, you're going to set up, shoot a number of pictures, and that's going to be kind of the end of story. It's not like the multiple exposures where you might shoot one picture and then add it to another picture or something like that, which was certainly an option that was available in the multiple exposure mode, which is, again, I think where the engineering went, well, we can't do that without the lens corrections, so we just don't have the feature. The other place that this came up recently, and this one's really frustrating for me on at least Canon's side, is the pixel shift multi-shot hyper resolution or super resolution mode. The technique works. It certainly worked back in the day where you could shoot handheld and you could upscale in Photoshop and stack and do all the processing and get higher resolution images out of it that way. And in the testing that I did on the super resolution mode, it works off of the pixel shift with the sensor shifting the pixel around. The problem goes back to this because, and I think this is a big part of it, in part because of the distortion correction and the fact that you can't just shuffle together the RAW files into a RAW file. Canon's implementation generates JPEGs. And as far as I'm concerned, it's an entirely useless implementation because it generates matrix or grid artifact riddled JPEGs for anything but the situation where you have a absolute complete control over everything in the scene and nothing can move whatsoever. So yeah, sure, they get to stick that it's a 400 megapixel image on the box, but it's not really a useful 400 megapixel image in the vast majority of situations. Now, my gripe with all of this is I'm not asking or saying that they should have had something that would stitch together a RAW out of all of this, but they could have at least had the option to just spit out a sequence of RAW files. So you do the pixel shift, and I mean, this is what Sony does. You do the pixel shift, and the camera can do the pixel shift without having to be hooked up to a computer or anything like that. And it spits out 9, or in the case, Sony's case, I think they can do 4, 9, and something else, RAW files. Just shoots them, writes them to the card. And it's your responsibility as the photographer to stack them, process them, fix them, do whatever you want to do in post. At a minimum, going about it this way ensures that, yeah, okay, maybe you have something moving and there is a problem and you're just not going to get clean images in post from this kind of situation. But at a minimum, you could just take one of those pixel shifted images and use that, and so at least out of the 9 45 megapixel images that were shot, you get one, that any one of them in theory, that you can use as the image. So, you know, okay, you don't get your 400 megapixel image, but you at least get a 45 megapixel image, which to me at least is way better than I don't get my 400 megapixel image and I don't have any image now at all. Now, my question to Canon on this is, okay, it's pretty clear that you were trying to put this into the R5 as something of a carrot, or not a carrot, peace offering, maybe. We didn't get the improved autofocus detection that the R6 Mark II and basically all of the new full-frame cameras have, including the very entry-level ones. So, here's a function or feature that you can have that nobody else has on their cameras in our product line, and here, hope that makes things okayer. I think that was very much the case of this function. However, the question I end up asking is, was this just a rush job, or was this more just we're not going to do non-RAW anymore? We're firmly embedded in this idea of, I don't know, if you're a RAW photographer, you know enough that you don't bother with these stupid things, in which case, if you think of it that way, then why are you including it in the camera at all? So, I don't get what was going on with that. I feel like there should have been an option to just do the pixel shift, but just give me the images. Let me, whatever format I have the camera set to, JPEG, RAW, whatever, shouldn't matter. Do the pixel shift process, give me the images, and let me worry about them. It certainly would have been easier. I mean, quite honestly, that would have been far easier than trying to stitch and blend everything together in camera. It would have been far easier to just say, here's the images. Do with them as you please. And, then you could open them up in Photoshop, or you could open them up in whatever, and you could make your hyper resolution image from that, and move on. So there wasn't really a consideration for RAW there. And I guess fundamentally, as a RAW shooter, this was a feature that I was sort of looking forward to, because there's a lot of situations where it would save me some time and effort doing like a pano or something like that if I could just multi-shot high resolution it, and then I can crop the 400 megapixel image down to 200 megapixel images, a 200 megapixel image, and, have something out of it. And of course, yeah, I could do the old style, handhold and shoot the 9 images or whatever, and open them in Photoshop and do that whole process. But being able to shoot from a tripod really seems like the better, or not the better, but having that flexibility seems like a real plus to me. And in fact, while sort of RAW things have been going away, if we stop and look at, we're not seeing really new features come to RAW. The only new feature we've seen come to RAW in the last, like 7, 8 years, since like 2016 or something like that, is lossy image compression. Like real lossy image compression. People will point to Nikon's lossy RAW that they had back, introduced back in the, with the start basically of their DSLRs. That was lossy, but not really lossy. And that's something that today we would just call, well, it's a log format, because that's really all it is they apply a log curve to the pixel information, and they discard basically redundant noise, inseparable due to noise information in the highlights of the image, and less or nothing in the shadows of the image. And now everybody's talking about, video, and I've got log formats, and I want to shoot and log this and log that, as if that was like the greatest thing that, greatest discovery out there. But really, at least in terms of RAW, or that was basically Nikon's, quote, lossy RAW from 2008. And it was a really smart design. So tangentially, it was modeled off of photon shot noise. So the curve they used was modeled off of photon shot noise. It basically just got rid of redundant information that you couldn't distinguish anyway from noise. So you could completely if you wanted to, you could completely reverse the losses in lossy raw by adding level-specific noise to the output image. And since noise is random, it doesn't really matter if it was the noise that you collected from the sun in the scene you were shooting or noise that your computer generated to fill in the gaps. It could have been completely reversed. So that's not even really lossy in that respect. Anyway, I'm talking about real lossy compression, like Canon's CRAW and Nikon's HE and HE Star high efficiency formats, where they are now doing essentially the same sort of process, the processing kind of that goes into something like a JPEG, where they are getting rid of information basically in a more complicated mathematical sense. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, that's not really shining praise of a new feature. We got a raw file that was a little bit smaller but throws away some image information. Okay. Certainly if you're a video shooter at any point, you're going to look at that and go, well, yeah, okay, so what? I've got a terabyte card in my camera. I don't care. 50 meg RAWs or 35 meg RAWs or 30 meg, whatever, doesn't bother me. I've got so much storage because of video requiring it that, it's not a big deal. I haven't shot CRAW seriously on my cameras since I started shooting video and basically got rid of my 64 gig cards and replaced them with 256 to 1 terabyte cards, because I don't need to save the card space in the field anymore. So yeah, not really shining praise that the greatest feature that's come out raw related is, and I'm talking camera feature, not like file feature, is we got lossy compression. Like, we aren't getting things like, or what we haven't gotten are things like, where's our raw histogram? Why can't we actually see what the raw data levels are without having the camera do all the processing for the image on top of that? Why aren't new features like the multi-shot high resolution mode on Canon being added as raw based, with a raw based output, or a genericized raw JPEG? Doesn't matter, but here's your source images. You're not being compensated or hampered from that. That's the kind of thing that I feel like makes raw death of a thousand cuts. It's not gone. It's not getting worse. It's just, we're not gaining, as raw shooters, we're not gaining capabilities in the same way that somebody who shoots JPEG does, even when that capability might make a whole lot of sense to us to use if it was there and worked. So with that said, I want to make a counter argument to this, because as much as I want to make the argument that I think raw is dying, I feel like there's also a good counter argument that it just doesn't need to be more. So raw works as advertised. It really does what it does, and there is nothing out there image format wise that is doing better in respect to so first of all, you get raw sensor data. So you get the widest capability of, our widest data range, widest amount of information, least processing going on. You can actually make scientific measurements from a raw file because you know exactly what the sensor was capturing, and you can take it so far as to characterize the quantum efficiency of the sensor, and then use that to count electrons, essentially, count electrons, count noise, that kind of thing. It gives us the highest quality and the highest dynamic range that the cameras can provide without a huge amount of, there's really no compromises in that. Sure, you potentially with 10-bit HEIF can have the same dynamic range as a raw file, but it can't have more dynamic range than a raw file, because a raw file is going to give you the maximum output of the capability of the sensor. And of course, there's a lot of stuff that's just flat out lossless. So you have no quality loss changing white balance. You have no quality loss changing picture styles or color adjustments, that kind of thing, because none of that exists until you make the image in your raw processing software. So it's super powerful, and that is what it's supposed to be. And it is very much a tool for the serious photographer. So then we could start talking about, well, why not include whiz-bang features like multi-resolution or whatever? Well, a lot of that can be done in post one way or another. You don't need the camera to do it for you. So the multiple exposures, for example, you can shoot multiple exposures as single off raw images and bring them into Photoshop and combine them any way you want. So like even for example, even the loss of the multiple exposure mode on modern Canon cameras, put your camera in RAW, set the exposure the way you need it to be, the right, exposure settings, shoot a burst of 10, 8, 16, 32, whatever images, bring them home, load them up in Photoshop, stack them, average them, and you've got the same thing that the camera was going to do. And, it's more professional, or at least more serious, or something like that. The need to get things right, or not right, but smaller in camera is mitigated by a lot of the technology that we have now. 256 gig and 1 terabyte media cards are not a big deal, especially if you shoot video. So if you can have a 256 gig card instead of a 32 gig card, and SD cards, 256 gig SD cards are not that expensive. They cost less than a 32 gig CF card 10 years ago. Then you don't need to stack a bunch of images and process it out in camera. You can just take it home and process it there. And, it's not a big deal that you're not getting all of these new whiz-bang features that are certainly whiz-bang, but they're also something that's maybe more relevant to novice, amateur, lower end, less serious, however you want to put it, photographers, because, multi-exposure, they can do it in camera, and, as a serious photographer shooting raw, you can take it home and just do it on your computer, and you probably know how to do that. For the most part, that counter-argument is okay, except again, when there aren't necessarily tools in place for certain things. So again, the pixel shift multi-shot, it's still a useful technique even if you're a raw shooter, but if you're not putting the ability to get the raw files out, you lose that capability. So what do you think? Do you see RAW do you shoot RAW, first of all, for stills? We're not talking about video here, as I said in the beginning. If you do you see RAW as something that is being neglected a little by the camera manufacturers? Is this just something that I'm seeing because of being a Canon shooter and the fact that they seem to be putting more emphasis on the whiz-bang features for JPEG users as opposed to RAW users, because presumably we're serious enough photographers that we know how to work around it and deal with it? Does this make any sense to you? If so or not or whatever, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. So with that said, I'm going to wrap this up. I hope you found this at least an interesting thought process. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, well, I don't know why I'm saying that. This is a vlog, and this is not the usual tech-related content, but it is camera-related, so if camera stuff and tech tips on the Canon system seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. And finally, if you'd like to support more content this channel and more content like this or any of my other videos, please consider hitting that thanks button. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.